Look at the sky above any major international airport today. You will see dozens of airlines from all over the world. But for more than half a century, one single blue globe ruled them all. At its absolute peak, this empire did not just fly planes. It built entire island bases across the Pacific, commanded the largest fleet of jumbo jets on Earth, and served as the official ambassador of the United States. If you were a movie star, a president, or a billionaire, you flew Pan Am. Period. It was an invincible corporate titan with massive cash reserves and unparalleled global power. Then, the engines went silent. The most recognized symbol of American wealth completely evaporated, leaving behind shattered aircraft, catastrophic debt, and thousands of weeping employees standing in empty terminals. How does a monopoly that literally defined the modern world absolutely destroy itself? Chapter 1. The Dreamer and the Ocean. The year was 1927. Aviation was largely a novelty, a spectacle for daredevils and barnstormers performing in dusty open fields. Most people looked at airplanes and saw dangerous toys constructed from wood, fragile canvas, and wire. They were incredibly noisy, notoriously unreliable, and prone to dropping out of the sky without warning. But a young man named Juan Trippe looked at those same rudimentary flying machines and saw something entirely different. He saw a vast web of invisible highways connecting distant continents. He saw the inevitable future of global commerce and human connection. Juan Terry Trippe was not your typical rugged aviator. He was a wealthy Yale graduate, a former Navy pilot who missed combat in World War I, and a man deeply obsessed with maps and global strategy. While his contemporaries were busy risking their lives trying to break local speed records or perform thrilling aerial acrobatics for small crowds, Trippe was studying geography and international relations. He understood a fundamental truth that would soon define the next half-century of human travel. The vast oceans were no longer impassable barriers. They were open roads, and the first person to build a reliable network to cross them would essentially control the world. To realize this massive vision, Trippe needed a strategic starting point. He found it at the absolute southern tip of the United States. Key West, Florida, sat just 90 miles away from Havana, Cuba. It was a relatively short hop over the water, but it represented a monumental leap for commercial aviation. In October 1927, a small Fokker F-7 tri-motor aircraft, leased by a newly formed and underfunded company called Pan American Airways, took off from a rough dirt runway in Key West. Its primary payload was not wealthy passengers or critical cargo, but ordinary sacks of mail. This initial flight was not about glamour or prestige. It was strictly about financial survival. Trippe knew that passenger travel in 1927 was far too unreliable, uncomfortable, and terrifying for the general public to support a profitable business. The secret to building a massive aviation empire did not lie in selling individual tickets. It lay in securing lucrative government contracts. The United States Post Office was actively desperate to speed up mail delivery to Latin America, aiming to beat European shipping lines. Trippe positioned his tiny, unproven company as the ultimate solution. The early operational days of Pan Am were chaotic and exceptionally dangerous. Pilots navigated simply by looking out the window, following coastlines, rivers, and railroad tracks. Accurate weather forecasting was practically non-existent. Radio communication was rudimentary and often failed completely. Yet Trippe pushed his crews forward relentlessly. He expanded routes rapidly from Havana deep into the Caribbean and steadily down the complex coast of South America. He proved to be a masterful and ruthless negotiator, charming and sometimes strong-arming foreign governments into granting Pan Am exclusive landing rights and vital concessions. Trippe operated more like a sovereign head of state than a standard corporate executive. He understood early on that aviation was a powerful instrument of foreign policy. By carrying the American flag to foreign ports, Pan Am essentially became an unofficial extension of the United States government. This unique relationship provided a massive strategic advantage. Whenever domestic competitors tried to challenge Pan Am on lucrative international routes, Tripp used his deep political connections in Washington to swiftly block them. The absolute turning point for the young company came when the U.S. government officially awarded Pan Am the exclusive foreign airmail contracts under the Foreign Airmail Act. This was the ultimate prize in the aviation industry. It guaranteed a steady, massive stream of revenue, effectively subsidizing the airline's aggressive expansion plans. While other aviation startups burned through their limited cash and went completely bankrupt trying to attract fearful passengers, Pan Am was getting paid consistently and handsomely just to carry letters. This highly reliable cash flow allowed Tripp to buy the absolute best equipment available, hire the most experienced pilots, and dream on a scale no one else dared to imagine. With Latin America completely secured and generating massive profits, Tripp turned his eyes toward a much larger and deadlier obstacle: the Pacific Ocean. It was a vast, terrifying expanse of deep water that had already claimed the lives of many brave pioneer aviators. Aviation experts widely stated that commercial flights across the Pacific were mathematically and mechanically impossible. The distances between land masses were simply too great, the weather patterns too unpredictable. Tripp completely ignored the experts. Armed with the immense financial security of the government postal contracts, he began plotting a highly ambitious route across the largest ocean on Earth. He started sending specialized teams to tiny, uninhabited coral atolls in the middle of the Pacific, building functional runways and critical refueling stations entirely from scratch. He was laying the physical groundwork for an empire that would soon dominate the global skies. The simple mail route to Havana had just been the beginning. The real conquest was about to start, and it would require a completely new type of flying machine to conquer the oceans. Chapter 2. The Era of the Flying Boats. By the early 1930s, Pan American Airways had a stranglehold on the Caribbean and South America. But Juan Trippe was looking further west, toward the massive expanse of the Pacific Ocean. There was a glaring logistical problem with his ambition. Land-based aircraft of that era simply lacked the fuel capacity to cross oceans, and even if they could, there were almost no paved runways anywhere in the world long enough to accommodate heavy, fuel-laden airplanes. Trippe found his solution in geography. He did not need concrete. 2/3 of the Earth was covered in water. He needed flying boats. Trippe commissioned aviation pioneers like Igor Sikorsky, Glenn Martin, and eventually the Boeing company to build massive multi-engine seaplanes. These were not the frail wooden contraptions of the previous decade. They were marvels of modern engineering, constructed of shining corrugated metal and built to withstand the brutal pounding of the open ocean. Pan Am christened them the Clippers, a deliberate nod to the fast, majestic sailing ships of the 19th century. The Clippers completely redefined the public perception of air travel. Before this, flying was a loud, cold, and nerve-wracking ordeal. The Pan Am Clipper was designed to replicate the experience of a luxury ocean liner. Passengers boarded not a cramped metal tube, but a spacious cabin featuring actual compartments, lounge areas, and dressing rooms. The seats converted into comfortable sleeping berths for overnight journeys. The noise of the engines was heavily soundproofed to allow for normal conversation. Trippe understood that he was selling an elite experience to the wealthiest people in the world. He demanded absolute perfection. The aircraft featured dining rooms where passengers were served multi-course meals prepared by chefs trained in high-end French restaurants. They ate on fine china, drank from crystal glasses, and used solid silver cutlery. The crew did not dress like typical daredevil pilots in leather jackets and flying goggles. Tripp outfitted his crews in crisp navy blue uniforms with white hats, heavily borrowing from maritime tradition. The pilot in command was officially called the captain. The co-pilot was the first officer. This naval aesthetic was a brilliant psychological tactic. It projected an aura of absolute authority, competence, and safety, reassuring nervous passengers who were paying a small fortune to fly over uncharted waters. But the ultimate test of the Clipper fleet was the Pacific. To connect San Francisco to Manila, Trippe mapped out a route that relied on tiny, isolated specks of land. Hawaii was the first logical stop, but beyond that lay thousands of miles of empty water. Tripp looked at old naval charts and identified Midway, Wake Island, and Guam as necessary stepping stones. Wake Island, in particular, was nothing more than a barren, sun-baked coral atoll inhabited only by birds and rats. In a staggering display of corporate might, Pan Am basically invaded Wake Island. They sent a supply ship loaded with construction crews, heavy equipment, and prefabricated buildings. Within months, Pan Am transformed a desolate reef into a fully functioning aviation base, complete with radio navigation towers, fuel depots, and a surprisingly luxurious 45-room hotel for overnighting passengers. Pan Am was no longer just an airline. It was an infrastructure developer, building its own sovereign outposts across the Pacific. The climax of this grand Pacific strategy arrived on November 22, 1935. A massive Martin M-130 flying boat named the China Clipper lifted off from San Francisco Bay, loaded with over 100,000 pieces of mail. It hopped from California to Hawaii, then to Midway, Wake Island, Guam, and finally Manila, completing the incredible journey in just under 60 hours of flying time. A sea voyage that normally took weeks had been condensed into a few days. When the China Clipper successfully completed its route, it was a global media sensation. Pan American Airways ceased to be merely a successful business. It became a towering symbol of American ingenuity and industrial dominance. The airline had conquered the world's largest ocean, turning science fiction into a scheduled commercial service. But Tripp was never satisfied with the present. Even as the flying boat secured his legacy, he was already plotting their replacement, pushing the boundaries of technology to go even faster and even higher. Chapter 3. Pioneering the Jet Age. By the early 1950s, the global landscape had shifted dramatically. World War II was over, leaving the United States as an undisputed economic superpower. The aviation industry had also been transformed by wartime innovation. Commercial airlines were ferrying millions of passengers across the globe in large, luxurious piston-engine aircraft like the Lockheed Constellation and the Boeing Stratocruiser. These propeller planes were elegant, but they had severe limitations. They were incredibly loud. They vibrated constantly, leaving passengers exhausted after long journeys. And most importantly, they were slow. A typical flight from New York to London still took up to 15 grueling hours, often requiring refueling stops in Newfoundland or Ireland. The British attempted to revolutionize the industry first with the de Havilland Comet, the world's first commercial jetliner. It was a beautiful machine, but early models suffered from catastrophic structural failures, leading to fatal crashes that terrified the traveling public. The disasters cast a dark shadow over jet technology. Many airline executives decided the financial and safety risks were simply too high. They chose to stick with the proven reliability of propellers. Juan Trippe viewed the situation entirely differently. He saw the Comet's failure not as the end of the jet age, but as a tragic engineering misstep that could be corrected. He understood the fundamental physics. Jets could fly much higher than propeller planes, climbing above turbulent weather systems into smooth air. They could fly virtually vibration-free, and they could travel at nearly 600 miles per hour, double the speed of the existing Pan Am fleet. Tripp knew that whichever airline successfully mastered passenger jets would instantly render every other airline on Earth obsolete. In 1955, Tripp made a move that shocked the entire business world. He did not just slowly dip his toe into jet aviation. He dove in with staggering financial force. Tripp initiated a fierce bidding war between America's two premier aircraft manufacturers, Boeing and Douglas. He demanded a jetliner capable of crossing the Atlantic nonstop with a full payload of passengers. When neither company could deliver exactly what he wanted immediately, Tripp simply ordered aircraft from both of them. He signed contracts for 20 Boeing 707s and 25 Douglas DC-8s. This massive purchase cost hundreds of millions of dollars. It was a breathtaking corporate gamble. Trippy was essentially buying highly expensive machines that still largely existed only on drafting boards and in wind tunnels. But the strategy was brilliant. By placing such a colossal order, Tripp forced the hand of his competitors. Every major airline in the world suddenly realized that if they did not buy jets, Pan Am would crush them. Tripp single-handedly launched the global jet age by writing a massive check. As the new aircraft were being built, Pan Am underwent a massive cultural transformation. The company needed a modern corporate identity to match its new technological superiority. They abandoned their old winged logo and introduced a sleek, minimalist blue globe laced with curved latitude and longitude lines. This simple blue sphere became one of the most recognized corporate trademarks in human history. Pan Am was no longer just a transportation company. It had become a cornerstone of American culture and a symbol of post-war prosperity. The airline defined international glamour. Movie stars, politicians, royalty, and business titans strictly flew Pan Am. The stewardesses, carefully selected and rigorously trained, were viewed as international ambassadors. They spoke multiple languages, wore tailored uniforms, and served passengers with an air of sophisticated grace. Walking into a Pan Am terminal was like entering an exclusive global club. The blue globe represented the ultimate American dream exported to the rest of the world. The absolute pinnacle of this era arrived on the evening of October 26, 1958. A Pan Am Boeing 707, christened Clipper America, idled on the tarmac at Idlewild Airport in New York. New York! On board were over 100 excited passengers, including prominent journalists and wealthy socialites. The massive jet engine spooled up with a deafening roar, a sound completely alien to commercial passengers at the time. The aircraft rocketed down the runway and climbed steeply into the night sky. Just 8 hours and 41 minutes later, Clipper America touched down gracefully at Le Bourget Airport in Paris. The passengers stepped off the plane, looking fresh and rested, completely avoiding the exhausting vibration and noise of the propeller era. The Atlantic Ocean, a vast barrier that had historically taken weeks to cross by ship and nearly a full day by earlier planes, had just been effectively cut in half. That single flight changed global geography forever. Pan Am was no longer just the most successful airline in America. It was the undisputed king of the global skies. Chapter 4. The Massive Gamble, called 747. The introduction of the Boeing 707 was a magnificent triumph, but its very success created an entirely new set of problems. As airfares began to drop and flight times decreased, millions of people who had never flown before rushed to the airports. By the mid-1960s, international terminals were struggling to handle the massive influx of passengers and aircraft. Runways were congested, and holding patterns became a daily nuisance. Juan Trippe looked at the crowded skies and concluded that buying more standard jets was a flawed strategy. Adding more planes would only increase the congestion. The logical solution, in his mind, was to build a single aircraft massive enough to do the work of 2 or 3 regular passenger jets. Tripp envisioned a behemoth capable of carrying nearly 400 passengers. He believed that by drastically increasing passenger capacity, he could slash ticket prices and permanently open the world to the American middle class. To build this giant, he turned to his longtime partner in innovation, Boeing President Bill Allen. During a private meeting, Tripp casually outlined his staggering demands. He wanted an airplane twice the size of anything currently flying. Allen was understandably hesitant. The prevailing wisdom in the aviation industry at the time was entirely focused on speed, not size. Governments and manufacturers were pouring billions into supersonic transport, convinced that the future belonged to planes that could fly faster than sound. Many engineers believed a giant, slow-moving airliner would only be useful for hauling cargo once supersonic jets took over the passenger market. But Tripp was relentless. He used his immense market power as leverage. He promised Allen that if Boeing committed to building the giant plane, Pan Am would be the primary launch customer. Allen famously countered that if Pan Am committed the money, Boeing would build it. That informal agreement launched the Boeing 747 project, an engineering endeavor so colossal it nearly destroyed both companies. The physical challenges of creating the jumbo jet were unprecedented. The aircraft was so incredibly large that Boeing did not possess a factory big enough to assemble it. They had to purchase a massive tract of forested land in Everett, Washington, and construct a brand new manufacturing facility, which remains the largest building in the world by volume. Engineers worked frantically to solve terrifying aerodynamic and weight problems. To accommodate front-loading cargo doors for the plane's eventual second life as a freighter, designers moved the cockpit above the main fuselage. This created the 747's iconic upper deck and signature hump. But the most severe crisis involved propulsion. The newly designed Pratt & Whitney high-bypass turbofan engines were remarkably powerful, but dangerously unreliable. During early testing, the massive engines frequently stalled, warped, or caught fire, delaying the entire project. Developing this Leviathan drained Boeing of all its liquid assets. The manufacturer was forced to borrow heavily, pushing itself to the absolute brink of bankruptcy. Yet the corporate culture at Pan Am remained insulated by a dangerous overconfidence. They had revolutionized aviation twice before, first with the flying boats, and then with the 707. The executives in New York firmly believed they were invincible. Their long-term financial models assumed that global passenger traffic would continue to grow at a staggering 15% every single year, indefinitely. They saw no limits to their own expansion. Fueled by this unshakable hubris, Tripp made a financial commitment that stunned Wall Street. In April 1966, long before the technical flaws were resolved or a working prototype had even flown, Pan Am signed a binding contract to purchase 25 Boeing 747s. The deal was valued at $525 million. Adjusted for inflation, it was a multi-billion-dollar gamble. Trippe was literally betting the entire net worth and future survival of Pan American Airways on a paper concept. When First Lady Pat Nixon officially christened the first Pan Am 747 in early 1970, it was hailed as a global marvel. Passengers stepped aboard and were greeted by spiral staircases, upper-deck cocktail lounges, and twin aisles that made the cabin feel like a spacious theater rather than a metal tube. It was the ultimate expression of corporate power and American industrial might. However, by signing that massive contract, Trippe had locked the airline into a mountain of rigid debt. Pan Am absolutely needed the global economy to remain flawless to fill those thousands of new seats. They had built the perfect machine for an era of endless prosperity, completely unaware that the golden age was already over. Chapter 5. The Perfect Storm. The Boeing 747 entered commercial service in January 1970. It was an engineering marvel and a public relations triumph, but the timing of its arrival was spectacularly unfortunate. Pan American Airways had designed the jumbo jet for a world of perpetual economic expansion. They had bet their entire future on the assumption that middle-class Americans would possess an ever-increasing amount of disposable income for international leisure travel. For a brief moment, that assumption seemed valid. But the global economy is a fragile ecosystem, and the golden age of post-war prosperity was about to shatter. In the early 1970s, a series of severe economic shocks began to destabilize the United States. Inflation crept upward, eroding the purchasing power of the average consumer. Economic growth stalled, creating a toxic financial condition known as stagflation. People who had been saving for grand European vacations suddenly found themselves struggling to pay for basic necessities at home. The massive surge in international travel that Juan Trippe had confidently predicted simply failed to materialize. Yet Boeing was delivering brand new 747s to Pan Am at a rapid pace, and the airline was legally obligated to pay for them. The situation escalated from a severe financial strain into a catastrophic crisis in October 1973. Following the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries instituted an oil embargo against nations that supported Israel, including the United States. The impact on the global energy market was immediate and devastating. The price of crude oil quadrupled in a matter of months. Lines at American gas stations stretched for blocks, and the era of cheap, abundant energy came to a violent end. For Pan Am, the oil embargo was not just a challenge. It was an existential threat. Aviation fuel is the absolute lifeblood of an airline, and it represents a massive portion of operating expenses. Prior to the crisis, fuel had been a relatively stable and predictable cost. Overnight, it became a massive financial drain. The Boeing 747, with its 4 massive turbofan engines, was incredibly thirsty. It was highly efficient when all 400 seats were occupied, but flying a jumbo jet with a light passenger load was an act of financial self-destruction. This was the exact nightmare scenario the airline now faced. Because of the recession, international passenger traffic plummeted. Tourists simply stayed home. Corporate executives slashed travel budgets. Pan Am was trapped. They had to maintain their scheduled routes to keep their valuable international landing rights, which meant they were forcing their massive new airplanes into the sky every single day. The visual reality was bleak. Huge, majestic 747s were crossing the Atlantic and the Pacific, carrying only a few dozen passengers. The sprawling cabins, featuring luxurious upper-deck lounges and wide aisles, were silent and empty. The financial mathematics were brutal and inescapable. The airline was paying record high prices for jet fuel to fly mostly empty planes, all while carrying a staggering burden of debt from purchasing the fleet in the first place. The massive cash reserves that Pan Am had carefully accumulated over decades of dominance began to evaporate at a terrifying rate. The company started losing tens of millions of dollars every quarter. The same ambitious strategy that had secured their global monopoly was now tearing the company apart from the inside. Juan Trippe had retired in 1968, leaving his successors to deal with the fallout of his grand gamble. The new management team found themselves completely paralyzed. They could not simply ground the 747 fleet because they needed the planes to generate whatever revenue was still available to service their massive debt. They could not raise ticket prices significantly because international airfares were still heavily regulated by government treaties, and a drastic price hike would only drive away the few passengers they had left. Pan Am was bleeding cash daily. The blue globe, once an invincible symbol of American wealth and corporate power, was suddenly representing an empire in deep distress. The executives desperately scoured their operations, looking for a way to stop the massive financial hemorrhage. They soon realized that their most fatal vulnerability was not the price of oil or the size of their planes. Their biggest weakness was an invisible boundary located right at the borders of the United States. The global giant was entirely disconnected from its own home. Chapter 6. The Fatal Domestic Void. As the financial losses from the half-empty 747 fleet mounted, Pan American executives were forced to confront a terrifying reality. The exorbitant price of jet fuel was only part of the problem. The core issue was structural, an inherent flaw baked into the very foundation of the company by Juan Trippe decades earlier. Pan Am was the undisputed king of international travel, flying to nearly every corner of the globe. But within the borders of the United States, the airline was practically non-existent. This was the fatal vulnerability that threatened to bring the entire empire crashing down. During the golden years of aviation regulation, Trippe had struck an unspoken deal with the American government. Pan Am would serve as the chosen instrument of United States foreign policy overseas, projecting American commercial power across the oceans. In exchange for this international dominance, Pan Am agreed to stay out of the domestic aviation market. They left flights between Chicago, St. Louis, and Atlanta to domestic carriers like United, American, and Delta. For decades, this arrangement worked perfectly for everyone involved. A businessman in Kansas City flying to Rome would buy a ticket on a domestic carrier to New York and then transfer to a Pan Am flight for the transatlantic journey. Domestic airlines essentially acted as a massive free feeder system, delivering thousands of passengers directly to Pan Am gateways every single day. But the aviation industry was evolving rapidly, and the Civil Aeronautics Board, the federal agency that tightly controlled airline routes, began to change the rules. Domestic airlines had grown incredibly powerful and ambitious. They aggressively lobbied the government for the right to fly internationally, arguing that Pan Am's monopoly was bad for consumers. The government listened and started granting their requests. Suddenly, carriers like Trans World Airlines and Northwest Orient were allowed to fly across the Atlantic and the Pacific. The impact on Pan Am was immediate and devastating. The businessman in Kansas City no longer needed to transfer in New York. He could simply board a TWA flight in the Midwest and fly all the way to Europe on a single ticket with a single airline. The domestic feeder network that Pan Am had relied on for its survival completely evaporated. Passengers naturally preferred the convenience of checking their bags once and dealing with one company for their entire journey. The massive Boeing 747s sitting at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York and at San Francisco International Airport were starving for passengers. Without a domestic route system to gather travelers from across the heartland and funnel them to these coastal hubs, Pan Am had to rely solely on people who lived in the gateway cities. Pan Am terminals became strange, isolated islands in American airports. You could fly from New York to London, Tokyo, or Buenos Aires, but you could not fly Pan Am from New York to Chicago or Los Angeles. The airline was hemorrhaging market share to competitors who possessed both domestic reach and international access. Realizing they were trapped in an unsustainable business model, Pan Am executives launched a desperate lobbying campaign in Washington. They pleaded with the Civil Aeronautics Board for domestic routes. They asked for permission to fly between major American cities simply to feed their own international flights. But the political landscape had shifted drastically. The immense political capital Juan Tripe had hoarded for decades was gone. The regulators and lawmakers viewed Pan Am as an arrogant, bloated monopoly that had ruthlessly bullied competitors and dictated government policy for years. Now that the giant was stumbling, there was very little sympathy to be found in the capital. The government repeatedly and coldly denied Pan Am requests for domestic expansion. They effectively trapped the airline in a regulatory cage. Competitors were allowed to invade Pan Am territory overseas, but Pan Am was strictly forbidden from fighting back on American soil. As the late 1970s approached, the situation turned from urgent to desperate. The domestic void was a bleeding wound that could not be stitched closed. The executives in New York realized that organic growth was impossible. If the federal government would not grant them domestic routes, they would have to find a way to buy an airline that already possessed them, no matter the cost. Chapter 7. The Shock of Deregulation and the Costly Mistake. By 1978, the political winds in Washington had changed completely. For decades, the Civil Aeronautics Board had acted as a strict referee for the entire airline industry. They dictated exactly where airlines could fly and exactly how much they could charge for a ticket. This tight regulatory environment had shielded established carriers from brutal free market competition. But a new philosophy was sweeping through the government. Politicians believed that unleashing the free market would lower fares for consumers. In October of that year, the United States government officially passed the Airline Deregulation Act. The immediate effect was absolute chaos. The protective walls were suddenly torn down. Any airline could now fly anywhere they wanted, provided they could secure the airport gates. Upstart discount carriers rushed into the market, aggressively slashing prices to steal market share. Established domestic airlines, suddenly free to roam the globe, launched their own international flights, directly attacking Pan Am on its most profitable and historic routes. For American World Airways, deregulation was the ultimate nightmare scenario. They were already bleeding cash from the soaring cost of jet fuel and flying largely empty Boeing 747s across the oceans. Now they faced a savage price war on all fronts. More terrifyingly, they still lacked a domestic route network to feed their international hubs. The executives in New York realized that building a domestic network from scratch would take years, time the company simply did not have. Out of sheer desperation, they decided they had to buy their way into the domestic market immediately. Their primary target was National Airlines, a profitable regional carrier based in Florida with a highly attractive network along the East Coast and the southern United States. It seemed like the perfect missing puzzle piece. If Pan Am could acquire National, they would instantly gain a functional domestic feeder system. But Pan Am was not the only company looking to expand in this new deregulated landscape. A fierce bidding war quickly erupted. Texas International Airlines and Eastern Airlines both launched aggressive takeover attempts for National. Driven by deep panic and a lingering sense of corporate arrogance, Pan Am executives refused to lose. They plunged into the bidding war with reckless abandon, treating the acquisition as a matter of absolute survival. Ultimately, Pan Am won the prize, but the cost was staggering. They paid nearly $400 million to acquire National Airlines. Many financial analysts at the time warned that the price was wildly inflated. Pan Am had used up a massive portion of its remaining cash reserves to buy a company that was only a fraction of its size. The acquisition was intended to be the grand salvation of Pan Am. Instead, it became a textbook example of a disastrous corporate merger. The immense problems began almost immediately upon signing the final paperwork. Integrating two massive, complex organizations requires careful planning and delicate execution. Pan Am attempted to force the two companies together practically overnight, creating a catastrophic culture clash. Pan Am employees viewed themselves as the absolute elite of the aviation world. They were accustomed to flying diplomats to Paris and movie stars to Tokyo. They looked down on the domestic operations of national airlines as inferior and provincial. Conversely, national employees viewed the Pan Am staff as arrogant, inflexible, and completely out of touch with the brutal realities of the new competitive market. The mechanical and operational incompatibilities were equally devastating. Pan Am operated a fleet built heavily around the giant Boeing 747. National airlines flew completely different aircraft, primarily McDonnell Douglas DC-10s and Boeing 727s. Pan Am mechanics did not know how to fix the national planes. Pan Am pilots were not certified to fly them. The company had to maintain entirely separate maintenance facilities, spare parts inventories, and training programs. This completely erased any financial efficiencies the massive merger was supposed to create. The final and most destructive blow came from the labor unions. In integrating the seniority lists of the two pilot groups sparked a bitter, protracted war. Seniority dictates everything for an airline pilot, from their salary to their schedule and what type of plane they are allowed to fly. The intense infighting destroyed employee morale. Strikes and walkouts crippled flight schedules across the entire network. Instead of a unified, powerful airline ready to conquer the deregulated skies, Pan Am became a dysfunctional, chaotic mess. The desperate gamble to buy survival had only accelerated their march toward total ruin. Chapter 8. Selling Assets to Survive. The disastrous merger with national airlines left American World Airways in a perilous financial state. As the 1980s began, the airline was hemorrhaging cash at an unprecedented rate. The global recession of the early decade, coupled with yet another massive spike in oil prices, pushed the company to the absolute brink of insolvency. The management team realized they could no longer outgrow their deep structural problems. To survive the immediate crisis, they had to drastically shrink. They had to start selling off the global empire Juan Trippe had spent a lifetime building. The first major casualty of this survival strategy was the airline's prestigious real estate portfolio. For decades, the Pan Am building had dominated the Manhattan skyline. Rising 59 stories directly above Grand Central Terminal, it was a colossal monument to the company's supreme power. It was one of the largest commercial office buildings in the entire world, with the massive, iconic Pan Am logo visible from miles away across the city. But corporate vanity could not pay the mounting fuel bills. In 1981, desperate for a massive infusion of working capital, the board of directors agreed to sell the building to the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company for $400 million. The transaction provided a brief financial lifeline, but watching those giant letters eventually come down from the New York skyline was a devastating psychological blow to the dedicated employees. It signaled to the world that the American giant was stumbling. However, the sale of the headquarters was nowhere near enough to stop the bleeding. The daily operating losses continued to mount, consuming the cash from the real estate sale at an alarming rate. Next on the chopping block was another crown jewel of the Pan Am corporate portfolio. This was the Intercontinental Hotels Corporation. Juan Trippe had founded the luxury hotel chain decades earlier to ensure his elite passengers had proper, high-end accommodations when they flew to developing nations. It had organically grown into a highly profitable, prestigious global brand with prime locations in major cities around the world. In 1981, Pan Am sold the entire hotel subsidiary to a British conglomerate for $500 million. They were essentially selling their most reliably profitable assets simply to fund the daily, money-losing operations of their airline. Financial analysts watched the process in absolute horror. They openly compared Pan Am to a starving man eating his own limbs just to stay alive a few more days. The strategy was entirely unsustainable. You cannot successfully shrink your way to long-term profitability when your core transportation business is fundamentally broken. By 1985, the financial situation had grown completely catastrophic. Pan Am was still severely struggling to compete in the heavily deregulated domestic market. They were heavily burdened by high labor costs from the national merger, an aging fleet of inefficient aircraft, and intense competition from aggressive, low-cost new carriers. They desperately needed another massive cash injection, and they had completely run out of real estate and hotels to sell. The only things left of real value were the airline routes themselves. The executives convened in New York to make the most agonizing decision in the history of the company. They looked at their global route map. The Atlantic routes were highly competitive and struggling to turn a profit. The Latin American routes were relatively stable, but not immensely valuable. The undisputed masterpiece of the Pan Am network was the Pacific Division. These were the historic, legendary routes pioneered by the flying boats decades earlier. They represented the heritage, the glory, and the supreme strategic triumph of the airline. They were also highly coveted by other expanding carriers. In a move that deeply shocked the entire aviation industry, Pan Am announced it was selling its entire Pacific route network, along with the aircraft and facilities that supported it, to United Airlines for $750 million. The sale was officially finalized in early 1986. It was an act of extreme corporate desperation that permanently crippled the airline. Pan Am completely surrendered its dominance over the fastest-growing economic region in the world. They handed their most lucrative market directly to a domestic competitor, instantly transforming United Airlines into a global powerhouse overnight. For the veteran Pan Am pilots and flight attendants who had spent their entire careers flying the Pacific, it felt like an absolute betrayal of their history. They watched in despair as United crews painted over the blue globes on the tails of their beloved 747s. Pan Am had traded its long-term future for a temporary, fleeting reprieve. The executives publicly claimed the massive cash influx would allow them to reorganize, modernize the remaining fleet, and refocus their energy on the Atlantic and Latin American markets. But the cold truth was undeniable. Pan Am was no longer the undisputed king of the skies. It was a hollow shell of its former self, completely dependent on the cash from the very assets it had just sold away. The grand empire was actively being dismantled, and the final curtain was rapidly approaching. Chapter 9. The Lockerbie Tragedy Destroys Trust. The sale of the Pacific routes in 1986 provided a brief illusion of financial stability. Pan Am management desperately tried to pivot their focus to the highly competitive transatlantic market and their remaining Latin American network. They updated their marketing campaigns and tried to project an image of renewed corporate confidence. But an airline cannot survive on public relations alone. To succeed on the international stage, an airline relies entirely on one invisible, foundational element: trust. Passengers need to believe that when they step onto an aircraft, they will arrive safely at their destination. In the late 1980s, Pan Am was about to lose that trust in the most horrific and public way imaginable. Pan Am was not just a commercial carrier. No, because of its history, its global reach, and its very name, the airline was widely perceived as the unofficial flag carrier of the United States. When the Blue Globe landed in foreign capitals, it represented American interests and American culture. In an era of rising global tensions and international terrorism, this high-profile status made Pan Am a prime target. Terrorist organizations understood that attacking a Pan Am jet was symbolically identical to attacking the American government itself. The dark reality of this status materialized on December 21, 1988. Pan Am Flight 103, a Boeing 747 named Clipper Mate of the Seas, took off from London Heathrow Airport bound for New York. It was just a few days before Christmas. The massive plane was filled with 259 passengers and crew, including dozens of American college students returning home for the holidays. No, as the aircraft reached its cruising altitude of 31,000 feet over the small town of Lockerbie, Scotland, a devastating explosion ripped through the forward cargo hold. The blast instantly destroyed the structural integrity of the jumbo jet. The aircraft literally disintegrated in midair, raining heavy debris and burning aviation fuel down upon the sleeping town below. All 259 people aboard the flight perished immediately, along with 11 residents on the ground in Lockerbie. It was a staggering human tragedy. The images of the shattered nose cone of the Pan Am 747 lying in a quiet Scottish field became one of the most defining and chilling news broadcasts of the 20th century. The immediate aftermath was defined by profound global grief, but that grief rapidly transformed into intense public outrage, directed specifically at American World Airways. Investigators quickly discovered that the explosion was caused by a bomb hidden inside a cassette player, packed into a suitcase in the forward cargo hold. More damning for the airline, it was revealed that the suitcase had been routed onto Flight 103 without the passenger who checked it ever boarding the plane. This was a catastrophic failure of basic security protocols. In the months leading up to the disaster, the Federal Aviation Administration had issued specific security bulletins regarding threats against American carriers in Europe. Pan Am had even instituted a new security program called Alert, charging passengers a $5 surcharge to supposedly fund improved screening. However, the investigation into Flight 103 revealed that the Alert program was largely a public relations facade. The actual security on the ground in Europe was alarmingly lax. Baggage handlers were overworked, screening equipment was outdated, and the crucial rule of matching every single piece of luggage to a boarded passenger was routinely ignored, simply to keep flights running on schedule. The revelation that the tragedy might have been prevented by basic diligence shattered whatever remaining loyalty the public held for Pan Am. The airline was heavily fined by the government for major security violations, but the financial penalties were nothing compared to the complete collapse of consumer confidence. Travelers became genuinely terrified to fly on a Pan Am aircraft. They actively chose to book tickets on foreign carriers or domestic rivals, believing that the Pan Am logo was a literal target for terrorists. Families of the victims organized and filed a massive civil lawsuit against the airline, accusing management of willful misconduct. The brand became deeply toxic. Travel agents reported that corporate clients were explicitly instructing them to avoid booking any travel on Pan Am. The empty seats on the transatlantic flights were no longer due to a recession or deregulation. They were empty because people were afraid. Pan Am was already standing on the edge of a cliff before December 1988. The bombing of Flight 103 simply pushed them over. The airline could survive bad management, high fuel prices, and fierce competition. It could not survive the absolute loss of public trust. Chapter 10. The Final Flight. By 1990, American World Airways was surviving entirely on borrowed time and borrowed money. The Lockerbie tragedy had inflicted a mortal wound on the brand. The airline was selling off its final remaining assets simply to meet daily payroll. The grand vision of Juan Trippe was completely gone. Management was desperately trying to operate a much smaller airline focused on Latin American routes, but the financial architecture of the company was fundamentally broken. They needed a miracle to survive. Instead, they got a war. In August 1990, Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait, triggering the Gulf War. The global financial reaction was immediate and violent. The price of crude oil skyrocketed, causing jet fuel costs to more than double in a matter of weeks. Simultaneously, the threat of international conflict combined with a looming global recession caused a massive sudden drop in passenger travel. People stopped flying. Even healthy airlines suffered massive financial losses during this period. For Pan Am, an airline already bleeding cash and suffering from a toxic public image, the crisis was an absolute death sentence. On January 8, 1991, the inevitable finally happened. Pan Am officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. This legal maneuver was a desperate attempt to freeze their massive debts and buy a few months to reorganize the company. The executives scoured the aviation industry looking for a corporate savior. They eventually found one in Delta Airlines. Delta agreed to purchase Pan Am's remaining profitable European routes, their lucrative East Coast shuttle service, and the historic Pan Am Worldport Terminal at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York. The deal included a crucial lifeline. Delta promised to inject hundreds of millions of dollars in cash to keep a much smaller, reorganized Pan Am flying, primarily serving the Caribbean and Latin America. For a fleeting moment in the fall of 1991, it appeared the historic brand might actually survive in a diminished form. Employees who had endured years of pay cuts, strikes, and corporate humiliation finally felt a small surge of hope. But the mathematics of the airline industry are unforgiving. The newly shrunken Pan Am continued to lose roughly $3 million every single day. The brand was simply too damaged to attract passengers, and the global economic recession kept travel demand incredibly low. Executives at Delta watched the cash they had injected evaporate almost instantly. They realized that saving Pan Am was a financial black hole that could eventually threaten their own survival. In early December 1991, Delta made a ruthless but necessary corporate calculation. They abruptly cut off all further funding. Pan Am executives pleaded for more time and more money, but the decision was final. Without the daily cash infusion from Delta, Pan Am could not buy fuel, pay landing fees, or issue paychecks. The company was completely out of options, out of assets, and out of time. The final order came down on the morning of December 4th, 1991. The CEO issued a heartbreaking directive to all stations. Pan Am was to cease all operations immediately. The execution of this order was swift and brutal. Pan Am flights that were already in the air were allowed to reach their destinations, but many aircraft preparing for takeoff were abruptly ordered to shut down their engines and return to the gate. Passengers were told to collect their luggage and find another way home. The scenes at major airports across the world were devastating. Thousands of dedicated Pan Am employees, many of whom had spent their entire adult lives wearing the iconic blue uniform, found out they were instantly unemployed through airport public address systems or frantic phone calls. Flight attendants, pilots, and ticket agents stood in the middle of crowded terminals, openly weeping and hugging one another. They were not just mourning the loss of a paycheck. They were mourning the death of an American institution. For over 60 years, Pan American World Airways had carried the flag of the United States to every corner of the globe. It had pioneered ocean travel, launched the jet age, and introduced the world to the jumbo jet. It had defined the absolute peak of international glamour and corporate power. But the world had changed, and the giant had refused to adapt until it was far too late. By the end of that cold December day, the last Pan Am Clipper touched down. The engines went silent, and the blue globe vanished from the skies forever.